Now, during the time of the judges, Israel was concentrated in the hill country, whereas Canaanites were in the cities in the more fertile valleys. And this will result in at least one of the practical reasons why Israel failed to drive out the Canaanites, which is described in the first couple of chapters. It says that Judah, when they took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive out the people from the plains because they had iron chariots. So there were some technological reasons for finding it difficult to dislodge the Canaanites. But then Benjamin didn't drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh didn't drive the people of Beth-shean or Taanach or Dor or Ibleam or Megiddo. And Ephraim didn't drive out the Canaanites in Gezer. Zebulun didn't drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Nahalol, and so on and so forth. They failed to drive them out. Why did they get bogged down? Well, again, the practical reasons was technological. And it's a little bit unexpected. In the book of Joshua, it looks like Israel was going from victory to victory. Joshua did help Israel get a foothold, but it was never a full occupation. It was up to the individual tribes to finish the job and to finish settling the land. And while Joshua was alive, Israel did well. But when he died, the new generation turned from the Lord into idolatry. Chapter 2 and verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And this leads to cycles of oppression, which characterizes the book of Judges. In this cycle, and you'll read about that if you would like, in Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23, there would be step 1 where Israel will sin. They will do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And then step 2 will be oppression. God will give Israel into the hands of oppressors. And throughout the book of Judges, there's various oppressors who rise up. Mesopotamian oppressors, Moabite oppressors, Philistine oppressors, Canaanite oppressors, Midianite oppressors, Ammonite oppressors. So step 1, sin. Step 2, God gives them over to oppression because of their sin. Step 3, prayer. Israel will cry out to God under their oppression, which leads to step 4, when God raises up a judge to save them. It says, chapter 2 and verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. But then, unfortunately, you go back to step 1, and Israel would sin and start the cycle over and over and over again during this period of the Judges. This reflects a theology of testing. God allowed this to happen to test Israel's obedience. That's what it says in Judges 2, 21 and 22. I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. So he allowed them to be oppressed to some degree to test them, and unfortunately, they failed the test. Well, that then brings us to the story of the judges, the major judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. You begin with the story of Othniel in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. He's the nephew of Caleb the spy that gave the good report along with Joshua, and a warrior during the days of Joshua. He delivered Israel from an oppressor from Aram Naharaim, that would be from the direction of Mesopotamia. And he was a model judge. He was raised up by God. He was invested with God's Spirit. Nothing much negative is said about him. Then comes Ehud, the left-handed judge, which years ago used to be on a Bible content exam that a lot of my students had to take. The question was, who is the left-handed judge? And the answer is Ehud. And you perhaps remember the story. He was a Benjaminite who was left-handed, who assassinated Eglon, king of Moab. He went to visit the king, hid his dagger on the right thigh under his clothing, the opposite side of where they might have frisked him. And when he was alone with the king with an audience, he pulled out his dagger and stuck it in the belly of the king. And the king was very, very fat, and the blubber went over the blade handle. And one of those wonderful stories that you read your children in Sunday school, or maybe not. The Bible doesn't say that God gave him his Spirit. It doesn't say that he judged Israel. And it's almost as if the Bible kind of condemns his left-handed cheating tactics. But then there's Deborah, the female judge. Deborah's name happens to mean a bee, as in the insect. She's the only female judge. She's also called a prophetess. She's the only judge that actually holds court. All the other judges are military leaders only and don't do any judging as far as we know. She led a kind of wimpish man by the name of Barak, who basically said, unless you go with me, I will not go to the battle. And she agrees to go. She helped Barak defeat the Canaanite enemy Jabin, king of Hatzor, and his general Sisera. This is what it says about Barak. Because he refused to go without Deborah, he would not receive the glory. I will go with you, but because of the way that you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, but the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman. Now the question might be, what woman? The obvious answer would be Deborah. But it turns out that that isn't actually what happens. There's a battle, and the woman who actually, to whom the glory goes to, is Jael. This is recorded in Judges 4:17 through 22. General Sisera fled from the battle. He sought rest in Jael's tent, and she gave him hospitality. But when the general fell asleep, exhausted from the battle, she drove a tent peg through his forehead. Thus, a woman defeated the enemy general. An issue in the Deborah story is, well, where are the men? Of course, we might ask the same question in terms of missionary activity. Where are the men? Turns out that there's about 2 women missionaries for every man missionary. Next major judge is Gideon. Judges chapter 6 through 9. He was a farmer. He was called by the angel of the Lord, but he had to be convinced by 2 miracles. One miracle involved fire springing from a rock and consuming meat. Another involved his putting out fleece and having it be wet when the ground was dry from the dew, and having it be dry when the ground was wet from dew. This may reflect a lack of faith or a lack of willingness to be used by God on the part of Gideon. Gideon acts against Baal worship. He destroyed the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole that was beside it. Though this didn't win him any friends, this created civil strife from the Baal worshippers. Though he had done the right thing, the reaction of the people led him to doubts about being called by God, and thus he puts out the fleece. Then you have the story of Gideon's 300 in Judges chapter 7. Gideon starts off with an army of 22,000, but the Lord tells him that's too many. So God forces him to reduce it to 300 men. Only those who lap water with their hands were allowed to serve in the actual invasion force. Then, using trickery, he defeated a much larger Midianite army. They broke pottery, they had torches, they made a lot of noise as if there were many more of them than just the 300. And in the darkness of night, it panicked the Midianite army, who ended up fighting against one another, not knowing who was who. And that routed them, and the Israelites came from the reserves and helped defeat the Midianite enemy. Gideon was humble and magnanimous. He placated the Ephraimites, who were upset that they had not been invited to the battle in chapter 8 and verses 1 through 9. He kind of lived up to the proverb, a soft answer turns away wrath, by being conciliatory and dealing with the ruffled feathers of the Ephraimites. He turned down an opportunity to be made king, but unfortunately he made an idolatrous ephod in chapter 8 and verse 27 that ends his story on a somewhat sour note. Abimelech, Judges chapter 9, was the son of Gideon, but not a very righteous son. He murders his brothers. He seizes the throne of Shechem and becomes king of Shechem. In fact, his name, Abimelech, Abi is Hebrew for my father, and Melech is the Hebrew for king. His name may mean my father was king. In other words, Gideon, who had been offered the kingship and refused it, was the legitimate king, and therefore he was claiming kingship as the son of the one who should have been king. Well, he carved out a small kingdom around Shechem, but he was killed by a millstone dropped by a woman in the besiegement of a town called Thebez. The scene was they were besieging the city. He was too near the wall. She dropped a stone down and hit him, and that was the end of his kingship and his life. A millstone, by the way, was used for making flour out of grain. We'll continue this discussion with the next video.